Even atheists acknowledge that the book that's most responsible for creating Western civilization is the Bible.
Hi, Dennis. So at it again, huh? You know, Dennis, I know you're conservative in a highly Christian country, but I have a question for you. You're a Jew that repeatedly argues that the Bible is the Word of God. This is the same book that has been used for millennia to justify the deaths of your ancestors. Okay, I get that it's your right, and admittedly, this point has nothing to do with the merits of this particular argument. It's just something I've never understood about you. And really, I would love to ask, because you make no sense to me at all, especially if you believe all the nonsense you spew. To my viewers, I'm going to give you a heads up about this video. As will become abundantly clear during my response, I haven't bothered to counteract some of his historical and biblical arguments. I'm not an Old Testament or Torah scholar, but you don't need to be to poke holes in his argument. He could actually be right about the history and still be completely wrong about his overarching point. So let's get back to Dennis the Menace.
Even atheists acknowledge that the book that's most responsible for creating Western civilization is the Bible.
Actually, Dennis, I would in part disagree with you. I would say that it's actually the Catholic Church's interpretation of the Bible and how it used that interpretation to keep its own power and to support various monarchs, wars, inquisitions, etc., that has helped lead us on our path to our current modern-day civilization. Before anyone accuses me of giving too much power to the Roman Catholic Church, I include in the development of Western civilization the fallout from the corruption of the Catholic Church, which resulted in the Protestant Reformation, and therefore breaking the Church's grip on civilization and allowing the flourishment of science and culture. It's a lot easier to get your point of view out of there if there are many different ideas on the marketplace instead of just one group's. By the way, Dennis, the Bible playing any part of that provides absolutely no support for it actually being true or a moral book. The Vedas played a huge part in developing the Hindu culture in India and other countries. Buddhism developed in China and Asian countries developed their culture. Does that prove that their foundational documents are true or moral? I would suspect you wouldn't agree with that conclusion.
Until very recently, that was considered quite an achievement. After all, it was Western civilization that created societies rooted in individual liberty, rooted in democracy, that affirmed the equality of all people, and which gave the world the notion of universal human rights.
Okay, let's say that Western civilization is actually entirely responsible for these concepts. How does that relate to the Bible? Where's your evidence that the Bible played a part in the development of these concepts? Democracy and the first discussions of individual liberty were actually being developed in ancient Greece. How about in the Buddhist empire of Maurya, pronunciation, which give varying amounts of rights to different ethnic and religious groups? Roman laws had certain limited freedoms for individuals. How does any of that relate to the Bible? These concepts were clearly around before the Torah became the Old Testament, and they were being discussed and debated in diverse places around the globe. Where's your evidence that the Bible actually did this and expanded on it?
Of course, these unique moral ideals took centuries to be realized, and the ideals were often violated. But only the West formulated these ideals, let alone achieved them, and then spread them around the world.
Wait, centuries? Centuries? How about more than a millennia? If we go from Emperor Constantine at about the 3020s to 3030s to what's called the Golden Liberty or sometimes the Noble Democracy in Poland in about 1573, that's 1200 years. It gets even worse if we start looking for modern democracies where common people were given the rights. So if the Bible is the source of all of this democracy and liberty, it's a pretty crappy source because clearly it wasn't a priority. However, since Golden Liberty in Poland and the case of proclamation in the 1610s in England, it's been about 500 years. Things really get cooking in the 18th and 19th centuries. And now, 123 out of 192 countries are considered democracies. And we live in a time period where significant chunks of the human race have more civil rights and human rights than at any other time period in history. We're not perfect, but we're certainly a lot better than we were even 200 years ago. Gee, what's changed in the last 300 to 500 years? Could it have been the Age of Enlightenment, the flourishing of science and philosophy? I freely admit the Age of Enlightenment had more than a little bit to do with the breaking of the power of the Catholic Church. But I don't see how the Bible made the Age of Enlightenment any better. No, not that. It's really the Bible. Okay, if you say so, Dennis.
In the last half-century, however, many of the recipients of these gifts, especially the well-educated, no longer regarded Western civilization as morally superior to any other. And as reverence for Western civilization fell, so did reverence for the source of that civilization.
Let's skip right over the bit where people are yelling, Western civilization has to go, and assume that somewhere somebody has actually done that. Let's talk about reverence. Reverence is defined as deep respect tinged with awe or veneration. Why the fuck would I venerate any civilization, let alone Western civilization? Why would I venerate a book? Show me that a civilization is good and its goodness outweighs the damage it caused, and I will respect that. Same for a book. Honest respect allows for honest criticism. Reverence implies that the thing that you revere has no flaws and is entirely desirable. There is certainly no civilization that has been without flaws. So why would I revere any civilization, including ours? And I certainly am not going to revere the very flawed Bible.
The Bible has not only been neglected, but reviled, as a foolish fairy tale at best, and as an immoral work at worst. This view springs not from intellectual rigor, but from intellectual laziness. People throw out all sorts of objections to the Bible as if there were no rational and moral responses to those objections. But the fact is, there are rational and moral responses to all those objections. I give many of them in my book, The Rational Bible.
Oh, look, product placement, which is your right. And actually, a lot of YouTubers do it. But gee, might you just possibly have a financial agenda with this video? You might just possibly be sales pitching your apologetics to other people who have had to face the problem of people telling them their holy book isn't so moral. Could be. Maybe not. Just something to point out. However, that even though I'm not great at logical fallacies, you did sound a little well-poisony when you claimed that people who disagree that the Bible is moral are intellectually lazy. You sure they're lazy, Dennis? Sure they just don't buy the Bible as a moral code? So gang, I'm going to have you hang on. I'm going to let Mr. Prager ramble on for a while. And if you're like me, you're going to get pissed, probably just like I did. There was a lot wrong with his arguments. But like I said, I'm not a biblical or Torah scholar, so I'm going to go right for the God-sized hole in his presentation.
But let me offer two here. In the biblical book of Deuteronomy, it says, if someone has a rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother, his parents can take him to the elders of the city for judgment, and if the son is found guilty, the citizens are to stone him to death. Sounds pretty primitive, doesn't it? In fact, however, it was an enormous moral leap forward. This law ended forever parental ownership of their children, and with it, the right to kill them. The brilliance of this law was that it seemed to preserve the absolute authority of parents, but in fact, ended it. But you will respond, the citizens of the city could still kill the child. Theoretically, that was true, but we have no instance of it ever happening in the history of the Jews, the people who brought the book into the world and lived by its rules. Critics of Western religion also often cite the famous biblical law, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, etc., as another example of an immoral biblical law. But this law, known by its Latin name, lex talionis, the law of retaliation, was another great moral advance. It was not meant to be taken literally, and it never was, for the simple reason that it's impossible to exactly duplicate bodily harm. Only a life for a life was meant literally, and taken literally, there is capital punishment for premeditated murder. So then, what did it mean? For one thing, lex talionis is the ultimate statement of human equality. Every person's eye is as precious as anyone else's. The eye of a prince is worth no more than the eye of a peasant. This was completely new in history. The Babylonian Code of Hammurabi, for example, legislated that the eye of a noble was of much greater value than the eye of a commoner. Second, the principle of an eye for an eye ensured only the guilty party was punished for his crime. In other law codes and in common practice, if you killed someone's daughter, your daughter would be killed. That was expressly prohibited in the Bible and by the eye for an eye code. Now the killer would be punished, not the killer's daughter. Third, lex talionis prohibited unjust revenge. In the ancient world, if a man gouged out another man's eye, the victim, if he could, would gouge out both the attacker's eyes or kill him or hurt his children, and so on. In contrast, eye for an eye ensured that the victim receive appropriate compensation for the damages he suffered, but the punishment had to fit the crime.
So Dennis, let's just presume that all of what you said is historically true. Given your known history of twisting wording and events to benefit your personal interpretation and goals, I highly doubt it. But for the sake of debate, I'll give you all that. If these were just human-created laws, and you were presenting the history correctly, then yes, they could probably be considered improvements on the past. However, you still have a big problem. You believe and assert that the Bible matters because of the claim that it is God's words and laws. Well, then you have a God that either isn't smarter than the people who were writing these in ancient times, isn't powerful enough to enforce better laws, doesn't actually care about human suffering, or doesn't exist. Any all-knowing, all-powerful God worthy of worship should be able to write laws that forbid the beating of children and still allow respect for the rights of parents. And they certainly shouldn't involve the threat of stoning of a child. That God should be able to teach his people and write laws better than an eye for an eye, and certainly more clear. If your portrayal of history is correct, again I doubt it, these could be considered progress in human laws. But a God should be able to write truly fair and just laws so that people of any time period can be taught to understand them. There should be absolutely no ambiguity about the morality or legality of rape, child beating, the equality of women, the morality of slavery, punishments for theft, murder, beatings, etc., etc. Instead, you had to work really hard to twist and turn to make two small sections of an ancient holy book sound moral instead of the batshit they clearly are. If biblical law is so clear, why are there reams and reams of rabbinical and Christian writings on how they should interpret those laws and how they should apply? Why would God's law ever require interpretation? And why does that interpretation change over time? Think it hasn't? How about slavery? The Bible has been interpreted to both support and decry slavery at different points in history. So clearly, the biblical law isn't clear.
The next time you read or hear someone argue that the Bible is irrational or immoral, tell them how the stone the rebellious son law ended parental killing of children, and how the eye for an eye law struck a unique blow for human equality and justice. If they're intellectually honest, they'll admit that they have learned something new. I'm Dennis Prager.
How about this, Dennis the Menace? I'll agree that I might have learned something new. I might have learned that rabbis were smart enough to use Old Testament statements and come up with some pretty good apologetics and interpretations that allowed them to twist the law so they didn't have to allow some pretty horrific things. Again, that all assumes that you're right about the history. I'll wait until someone who knows a lot more about that time period than I do before I completely buy your claims. But as for your suggestion that the Bible is the source of Western civilization and that we should revere it, nope. Like I said, the Catholic Church, the Protestant Reformation, and the biblical interpretations thereof did play a huge part in how Western civilization changed and developed. But that certainly doesn't prove that we should revere Western civilization, the Bible, or the Bible's hypothetical God. Thanks again to all my new subscribers and welcome to my insane asylum. And I really want to give a shout out and a thanks to Skeptical Pork who sent me this great drawing of my snail.